wonderful to be here in the fabled Mehboob Studios. Thank you all for coming. And yeah, this has been a very amazing time because Bachi and the Times Lit Fest are giving me this Lifetime Achievement Award. And on top of that, yesterday I heard about the Gyanpeeth, and it's really rather overwhelming because, you know, to anybody in an Indian literary world, the Gyanpeeth is like the Grail. So it's kind of incredible to get it, and thank you. Thank you. And I really feel kind of overwhelmed by it. Anyway, I'm here to talk to you about my new book, which will be out in June. It's called Gun Island, and here is the cover. I don't know if you can see it. Does it show? Oh, you can see it, can you? Okay, great. So it's going to be out in June this year from Penguin. Now this book, Gun Island, is actually, it begins in the Sundarbans, and another one of my books also starts in the Sundarbans. That book is called The Hungry Tide. The Sundarbans is, I mean, those of you who've been there will know it's a very extraordinary landscape, and very appropriately for this year's theme, it's really a landscape which is all about water. But water, the strange interaction of water and land creates a kind of atmosphere. It creates a lived experience which is really completely different from anything one might imagine in every way, not just in terms of your physical atmosphere, but also in terms of your lived experience. So this book, Gun Island, it has some of the characters who featured in The Hungry Tide. And when I started writing the book, I went back to my notes and my research for The Hungry Tide, and I found all this footage that I had shot with a primitive camera, video camera, back in the year 2000. So I sat down and, you know, all of you here being Mumbaikars are probably very fluent with editing of film and so on, but I'm not. But I somehow taught myself a little bit about how to do it. And I made a little 5-minute film, which I'm now going to show you. So here we are.
গন ফেললে ধরো এই সব কাঁকড়া ফাঁকড়া হয় আর কি। আজ এই সব জড়িয়ে যাচ্ছে ওদিক চাল হচ্ছে এই চার তো ফেলার সঙ্গে সঙ্গে কাঁকড়া এসে ধরবে। এই চার ঘেরানে, এই মাছের ঘেরানে এসে কাঁকড়া আসবে। ওই দোনে কাঁকড়া ধরলে এবার এই জালতি দিয়ে কাটিয়ে এভাবে তুলতে হবে।
বাঘের ভয় করে না?
হ্যাঁ করে। ওই দেখে
আয়মে আল্লাহ দুয়মে বিসমাল্লাহ সিয়মে নবীজির নাম চারমে আল্লাহ ছি
কিছু কিছু হবে ভিতরে গাছ হবে না বাইরে গাছ
যা মন্ত্র সেটাই বলে ওটা তো আমরা বলবে না
দাদু ওই দিদিমা আসছে
এই খোঁজটা
ওই একটা
পূর্ব দেশে বাদাবন সেটা হয় যাইছে যাকে তা হলো জিতে হে সকলে তেজিহা বন বিবি
এটা হচ্ছে মোল্লাদের, এটা আমাদেরই না। আমরা করি কেন যে আমাদের এই পূজা জঙ্গলে আমরা থাকতে হয়, ওই মাকে বলে আমরা মা চরণ ধরে নিয়ে জঙ্গল চলি। এই জন্য আমরা হিন্দু শাস্ত্রে মাকে পূজা করি। হ্যাঁ, আদি মন্ত্র পূজা হচ্ছে মুসলমানের। হ্যাঁ, আমাদের কালী হরি দুর্গা শিব আমরা করতে পারি, এটা আমরা করি কেন না আমরা জঙ্গলে চলি, এই কারণে আমরা পূজা করি, মাকে ভক্তি করি। মার ভক্তির কারণে আমরা এই পূজাটা করি, বুঝতে পারতেছেন? এই বনৌদ এই বাড়ু করি, এটা আমাদের এখন আমাদের পেশা হয়ে গেছে ওই মায়ের পূজা। আর ওদের কিরাম ওই মসজিদ ঘর আছে, সেখানে যাবে নামাজের খানায় নিয়ে নামাজ করে পূজা করবো। ওই একদিনই নীলা খেলা, আজকে কালকের হয়ে গেছে ওদের পূজা। হ্যাঁ
আচ্ছা, বনবিবির পূজা।
হ্যাঁ, কালকে ওদের পূজা হয়ে গেছে, বলু হয়ে গেছে। ওই বনবিবি আছে মুসলমানের মেয়ে, বুঝতে পেরেছেন? মুসলমানের মেয়ে ওই ওর মাকে গর্ভসমুদে ওই জঙ্গলে তুলে দিয়েছিল বাবা।
So there you are. Well, as you can see, the traditions of Bengal, of the folk traditions of Bengal, and indeed of many other parts of India, really don't conform at all to the sorts of discourse that we get about religion and about religious divisions and so on. And just as in the Sundarbans, you can't separate land and water, you really can't separate different sorts of traditions either. It's a very, very much more complicated phenomenon than people think. Anyway, so now I'm going to read to you about from my new book, Gun Island. As you can see, it's really new. So I'm reading from the manuscript. The strangest thing about this strange journey was that it was launched by a word, and not an unusually resonant one either, but a banal, commonplace coinage that is in wide circulation from Cairo to Calcutta. That word is banduk, which means gun in many languages, including my own mother tongue, Bengali or Bangla. Nor is the word a stranger to English. By way of British colonial usages, it has found its way into the Oxford English Dictionary, where it's glossed as rifle. But there was no rifle or gun in sight the day the journey began, nor indeed was the word intended to refer to a weapon. And that precisely was why it caught my attention, because the gun in question was a part of a name, Bonduki Shodagor, which could be translated as the gun merchant. The gun merchant entered my life, not in Brooklyn, where I live and work, but in the city where I was born and raised, Calcutta, or Kolkata, as it is now formally known. That year, as on many others, I was in Kolkata through much of the winter, ostensibly for business. My work as a dealer in rare books and Asian antiquities requires me to do a good deal of on-site scouting. And since I happen to possess a small flat in Kolkata, carved out of the house that my sisters and I inherited from our parents, the city has become a second base of operations for me. But it wasn't just work that brought me back every year. Kolkata was also sometimes a refuge, not only from the bitter cold of a Brooklyn winter, but from the solitude of a personal life that had become increasingly desolate over time, even as my professional fortunes prospered. And the desolation was never greater than it was that year, when a very promising relationship came to a shockingly abrupt end. A woman I had been seeing for a long time cut me off without explanation, blocking me on every channel that we had ever used to communicate. Suddenly, with my 60s looming in the not-too-distant future, I found myself more alone than ever. So I went to Calcutta earlier than usual that year, timing my arrival to coincide with the annual migration that occurs when the weather turns cold in Europe and North America, and great flocks of foreign-settled Calcuttans like myself take wing and fly back to overwinter in the city. I knew that I could count on catching up with a multitude of friends and relatives, that the weeks would slip by in a whirl of lunches, dinner parties, and wedding receptions. And the thought that I might, in the midst of this, meet a woman with whom I might be able to share my life was not, I suppose, entirely absent from my mind. But of course, nothing like that came to pass, even though I lost no opportunity to circulate and was introduced to a good number of divorcees, widows, and other single women of an appropriate age. So the months slipped by in a cascade of disappointments, and the day of my return to Brooklyn was almost at hand when I went to the last of my social engagements of the season, the wedding reception of a cousin's daughter. I had just entered the venue, a stuffy colonial-era club, when I was accosted by a distant relative, Kanai Dutt. I hadn't seen Kanai in many years, which was not entirely a matter of regret for me. He had always been a glib, vain, precocious know-it-all who relied on his quick tongue and good looks to charm women and get ahead in the world. He lived mainly in Delhi and had thrived in the hothouse atmosphere of that city, establishing himself as a darling of the media. It was by no means uncommon to turn on the television and find him yelling his head off on a talk show. He knew everyone, as they say, and was often written about in magazines, newspapers, and even books. The thing that most irritated me about Kanai was that he always found a way of knocking me off my balance. This occasion was no exception. He began by throwing me a curveball in the shape of my childhood nickname, which I had long since abandoned in favor of the more American-sounding Dean. "Tell me, Dinu," he said after a cursory handshake, "is it true that you have set yourself up as an expert on Bengali folklore?" The almost audible sneer rattled me. "Well," I spluttered, "I did some research on that kind of thing a long time ago, but I gave it up when I left academia and became a book dealer." "But you did get a PhD, didn't you?" he said with barely concealed derision. "So you are technically an expert." "I would hardly call myself that." He cut me short without apology. "So tell me then, Mr. Expert," he said, "have you ever heard of a figure called Bonduki Shodagor, or the gun merchant?" He had clearly been intending to surprise me, and he succeeded. The name Bonduki Shodagor, or the gun merchant, was so new to me that I was tempted to think that it was made up. "What do you mean by figure?" I said. "You mean some kind of folk hero?" "Yes, like Dukkhin Rai or Chand Shodagor." He went on to name a few other well-known characters from Bengali folklore: Shuttupir, Lukhindor, and the like. Such figures are not quite gods, and nor are they merely saintly mortals. Like the shifting mudflats of the Bengal Delta, they arise at the conjuncture of many currents. Sometimes shrines are built to preserve their memory, and almost always their names are associated with a legend. And since Bengal is a maritime land, seafaring is often a prominent feature of such tales. The most famous of these stories is the legend of a merchant called Chand Saudagar, who is said to have fled overseas in order to escape the persecution of Manusha Devi, the goddess of snakes and of all poisonous creatures. There was a time in my childhood when the merchant Chand and his nemesis, Manusha Devi, were as much a part of my dream world as Batman and Superman would become after I had learnt English and started to read comic books. Back then, there was no television in India, and the only way to entertain children was to tell them stories. And if the storytellers happened to be Bengali, then sooner or later they were sure to circle back to the tale of the merchant Chand and the goddess who wanted him as her devotee. The story's appeal is, I suppose, not unlike that of the Odyssey, with a resourceful human protagonist being pitted against vastly more powerful forces, earthly and divine. But the legend of the merchant Chand differs from the Greek epic in that it does not end with the hero being restored to his family and patrimony. The merchant's son, Lukhindor, is killed by a cobra on the night of his wedding, and it's the boy's virtuous bride, Behula, who reclaims his soul from the underworld and brings the struggle between the merchant and Manusha Devi to a fragile resolution. I don't remember when I first heard the story or who told it to me, but constant repetition ensured that it sank so deep into my consciousness that I wasn't even aware that it was there. But some stories, like certain life forms, possess a special streak of vitality that allow them to outlive others of their kind. And since the story of the merchant and Manusha Devi is very old, it must, I suppose, possess enough of this quality to ensure that it can survive extended periods of dormancy. In any event, when I was a 20-something student, newly arrived in America and casting about for a subject for a research paper, the story of the merchant thawed in the permafrost of my memory and once again claimed my full attention. It was then, as I began to read some of the Bangla verse epics that narrate the merchant's story, and there are many such, that I discovered that the legend's place in the culture of Eastern India was strangely similar to the pattern of its life in my own mind. The origins of the story can be traced back to the very infancy of Bengal's memory. It was probably born amidst the original autochthonous people of the region and was perhaps sired by real historical figures and events. To this day, across Assam, West Bengal, and Bangladesh, there are numerous sites and archaeological remains that are linked in popular memory to the merchant and his family. And in popular memory, too, the legend seems to go through cycles of life, sometimes lying dormant for centuries, only to be suddenly rejuvenated by a fresh wave of retellings, in some of which the familiar characters appear under new names, with subtly changed plot lines. A few of these epics are regarded as classics of Bengali literature, and it was one such that became the subject of my research thesis, a 600-page poem in early Bangla. This text was conventionally agreed to have been composed in the 14th century, but of course nothing is more grating to an aspiring scholar than a conventional opinion. So in my thesis, I argued, citing internal evidence, such as the mention of potatoes, that the poem did not find its final form until much later. It was probably completed by other hands, I claimed, in the 17th century, well after the Portuguese had introduced New World plants to Asia. From there, I went on to argue that the life cycles of the story, its periodic revivals after long intervals of dormancy, were related to times of upheaval and disruption, such as the 17th century was in those parts of India where Europeans established their first colonies. So, Dinanath is thinking about all this, and then Kanai says to him, he says to Kanai, are you sure you have the right name, Bunduki Saudagar? Maybe you misheard it or something. But Kanai stood his ground, insisting that he had used the phrase Bunduki Saudagar, a gun merchant, advisedly. I'm sure you know, he said in his maddeningly superior way, that the figure of the merchant crops up under many different names in our folklore, Sometimes the stories are linked to certain places. And my feeling is that the legend of Bondu Ki Saudagar is one of those, a local tale. Why? Because his legend is tied, said Kanai, to a shrine, a dham in the Sundarbans. The Sundarbans. The idea that there might be a shrine hidden inside a tiger-infested mangrove swamp was so far-fetched that I burst into laughter. Why would anyone build a dham in a swamp? Maybe, said Kanai coolly, because every merchant who's ever sailed out of Bengal has had to pass through the Sundarbans. There's no other way to reach the sea. The Sundarbans are the frontier where commerce and wilderness look each other directly in the eye. That's exactly where the war between prophet and nature is fought. What could be a better place to build a shrine to Manasha Devi than a forest that's teeming with snakes? But has anyone ever seen this shrine, I asked. I haven't been there myself, said Kanai, but my aunt Nilima has. So Nilima Ghosh is a figure in The Hungry Tide. She's a sort of NGO person who's built a very important NGO in the Sundarbans. So one thing leads to another, and finally Dinanath Datta decides that he's going to go and have a look at this shrine in the Sundarbans. On the way there, he meets up with a boy called Tipu. Those of you who've read The Hungry Tide will remember a character called Fokir, and Tipu is actually Fokir's son, and Tipu is now 18 years old. So I did not imagine that it would fall to my lot to meet Tipu. Tipu was actually, after his father's death, he was adopted by an Indian-American researcher by the name of Pia and taken to America for a while, but it didn't suit him. He came back to the Sundarbans and is living there. I did not imagine that it would fall to my lot to meet Tipu. But at Bashanti, as we were walking along an embankment, Moina, his mother, suddenly cried out, "Why, here he is, Tipu." Where? She pointed ahead to a small, slight youth who was slouching towards us with his hands thrust deep into the pockets of his slack-waisted jeans. "I didn't think he would be here," said Moina. "Nilima Di must have told him you were coming." Moina's description of her son had led me to expect an abject and morose young fellow. But it was evident at a glance that Tipu was a creature of an altogether different kind. He had the probing eyes and darting movements of a hungry barracuda. He even glinted barracuda-like because of a silver ear stud and glittering highlights in his hair, which was spiky on top and flat at the sides. As for his clothes, a Nets t-shirt and baggy jeans that kept slipping down to expose his bright red boxers, they would not have looked out of place in Brooklyn. We soon learned, so Tipu had been speaking Bangla all this while in an unenthusiastic murmur, but his voice rose as he turned to me and stuck out his hand. "Hey there," he said, sticking out his hand. "How you doing?" Shaking his hand, I said, "Hi, I know who you are, Pops," said Tipu, grinning. "I know all about you." I was dumbfounded. How? How do you know all about me? "I looked you up in the net." I don't know what annoyed me more, the insolence of his tone or that he had decided to call me Pops, as though I were a character from a comic book. But being unable to think of a suitable rejoinder, I decided that it would be best to ignore him as far as possible. Along with Tipu, Dinanath Datta goes into the jungle in the Sundarbans, and finally he comes to this shrine. And one of the things that happens to outsiders when they go to the Sundarbans is that they always fall in the mud, because the mud is almost thigh deep often. And if you don't know how to walk in that mud, you're always going to fall and get plastered in mud. And that's what happens to Dinu Datta. So he's finally almost carried into the shrine, and he's sitting there. And Tipu and Horin, who's the boatman, go away to look for a boy called Rafi, who is the caretaker of the shrine. So he's alone now in the shrine. Only after Tipu and Horin had left did I get to look around properly. And then suddenly it was as though everything I had gone through to get there, the mud, the humiliation, the freezing baptism, had all been worth it. I discovered now that I was standing at the center of a rectangular courtyard with my back to the temple, which was at the other end of the walled enclosure. It wasn't till I had turned around that the facade came into view. The building wasn't large, no bigger than the familiar thatched huts of the Bengal countryside, and time had not been kind to it. Yet the structure was so unexpected and so lovely that the sight fair took my breath away. The roof of the shrine had the convex outline of an upturned boat. And it was this, I guess, that gave it the appearance of a Bishnupuri temple. Nor was it surprising, for everything about the structure, its burnt sienna color, the shape of the roof, and the panels on its facade, spoke of Bengal's most celebrated style of architecture, which had originated in the kingdom of Bishnupur in the 17th century. This is a style which is perfectly attuned to the place in which it was born, in the sense that it echoes the shapes and forms of the Bengal countryside. It also makes ingenious use of the region's most easily available materials. Rather than aspiring to the grandeur of stone, of which Bengal has very little, it relies instead on brick made with the delta's ample supplies of mud and silt. The rich color of these thin, hard bricks is, to my eyes, one of the glories of the Bishnupuri style. So Bishnupuri temples always have these reliefs on the walls which narrate the story of the shrine. So Dinanath Datta gets very absorbed in trying to, in examining these shrines, and he looks around and he's completely fascinated by what. So caught up was I in thinking about the shrine's exterior that it was almost as an afterthought that I wandered through the arched gateway that led to its interior. It was very dark inside and seemed even more so because of the contrast with the bright mid-morning sunlight outside. But as soon as I had stepped past the gateway, I knew from the echoing of my bare feet that I was in a cavernous domed hallway of a kind that is characteristic of this style of architecture. The interiors of Bishnupuri temples are often open in the manner of congregational spaces, possibly because of Islamic or Christian influence. But exactly how tall or wide this space was, I couldn't tell, for I was aware only of a slippery mossiness beneath my feet and a chilly, slightly fetid dampness around me. As I was looking around, I became aware of a low, growling sound somewhere behind me. I spun around, thinking that a dog had followed me inside. But no. Framed in the arched gateway was the face of a shaggy-haired boy who was staring at me in what seemed to be utter disbelief. Who could this be but the much-awaited Rafi? I was so delighted to see him that I hurried eagerly towards the entrance, crying out loudly, "Eitto, here you are, I've been waiting for you." But this didn't halt his retreat. He continued to back away from me until his withdrawal was halted by the rim of the well. There at last he came to a sudden standstill. Dropping his eyes, he began to breathe heavily, as if in relief at a narrow escape. He looked to be in his late teens, with a lightly feathered upper lip. His face was narrow, with large eyes and a full, deep brown mouth that was downturned at both ends. His feet were bare, thickly coated with mud, and he was dressed in a frayed shirt and a frayed cotton lungi that was doubled up above his knees. "I seem to have caught you by surprise," I said. "You're Rafi, aren't you?" He nodded and straightened himself. "And who are you?" he said. I noticed that his Bangla accent was marked with the rustic lilt of the Sundarbans. "I'm Dinanath Datta," I said in what I hoped was a soothing tone. "I just came to look at the temple." "Is that so?" said Rafi. "Why? What's so interesting about the temple?" I said, "I just wanted to ask you a few questions about the shrine." "I don't know that I can tell you anything," said Rafi. "I never had much to do with this shrine. My grandfather used to talk about it, but I don't remember anymore." It was clear from his tone that he had had enough of my questions. He turned his back on the shrine with a gesture of dismissal. "Of course, it's all nonsense," he said. "There is no gun merchant or gun island. It's just a fairy tale. No one can rule over snakes." This was said with great vehemence, yet there was an undertone in his voice that led me to wonder whether his skepticism about the legend had something to do with some long-ago crisis of disappointment, maybe of the kind that besets children when they learn there is no Santa Claus and no toy factory at the North Pole. "You're right," I said, humoring him. "And it's obvious, isn't it, that this dham has nothing to do with Manusha Devi." A look of puzzlement came into his eyes now as he turned towards me. Why? He said. Why do you say that? Because, I said, if Manasha Devi had anything to do with this place, then surely there would be a snake around here, wouldn't there? A cobra. I glanced at him again and saw to my surprise that his face had gone rigid. He was staring fixedly at me with a hand over his mouth. What's the matter? I said. Ki hoyeche? Slowly his hand fell away from his mouth. But there is, he whispered. There is what? There is a cobra inside the dham. It's been there many years. It was my turn now to stare in disbelief. Impossible, I said. I went inside the dham. I didn't see anything. It was right behind you, he said. When you came out from the dham, I could see it behind you. Its hood was raised and its head was above your shoulder. I've never seen it like that before. It never comes out when I'm here, and I leave it alone too. It keeps other snakes and animals away. I never go in there. You must have disturbed it. No, I said, shaking my head. No, it's not possible. At that moment, I was absolutely certain that he was joking or deluded. It was simply unimaginable that I had stepped into a cobra's lair. Such things don't happen to people like myself, retiring antiquarians who spend most of their waking hours staring at screens and old books. At this point, we were at one of the dham's far corners, where the facade joined the compound's surrounding wall. From that angle, almost nothing was visible of the building's interior, except the arched entrance and the darkness inside. Such was my incredulity at what I had just heard, that my feet began to move of their own accord. Before I knew it, they had brought me face to face with the entrance, so that I could confirm with my own eyes that everything was as I had thought. And then suddenly there it was, appearing out of the darkness like a whiplash, rearing up as if it had been waiting for me, the intruder, to show himself again. Staring at it now, at a distance of only a few feet, I realized that it was no ordinary cobra, but a king cobra, a hamadryad, of a size such that its upraised head was level with mine. Its tongue flickered as I looked into its shining black eyes, and I became aware of a growling sound. I would learn later that this species does not hiss, but emits this other sound instead. I stood frozen, as if welded to the ground. Yet, although it was well within reach of me, I'm convinced to this day that the cobra would not have harmed anybody if not for what came next. Unbeknownst to me, Tipu had arrived at the compound's gate moments earlier and had observed the scene as it was unfolding. Imagining that I was about to be attacked, he had snatched up a fishing net and crept stealthily into the courtyard. It was only when the net was cast at the cobra that I became aware of Tipu's presence, and it was then too that the creature struck with astonishing speed and power. Even as the net was descending over its hood, it flung itself at Tipu and succeeded in striking him with one fang just above the left elbow. And then, just as suddenly as it had appeared, the cobra was gone, and the net was lying empty on the ground. Tipu was on his knees, hunched over his elbow, staring at the wound on his arm. Then he slowly crumpled to the ground and looked straight into my eyes. What do I do now, Pops? He said in a whisper. So I'll stop there. Thank you.